Today we're answering another subscriber question you guys ask, we do our best to answer. And that question is, so the question we're going to ask is in response to the Gigabyte TRX 40 Designare BIOS Update F4Q video. Family fun, great video. Now, the question is, are two RTX 3070s better than one RTX 3090 for 3D work with the Threadripper 32 cores, 128 gigs of RAM? Not sure what to buy. I'm not a gamer, and there's bunches of videos for gamers, but hardly anything for workstations and their performance. And I want bang for the buck. I agree with you, and I hear you on that. And by the way, welcome everybody. This is Builder By. My name's Gil Boyd. Thanks for joining us. Now, for this question, there's a lot of different ways we can come at this, because another subscriber commented that he has an RTX 3090 that takes up 3 slots. So I'm going to address that as well. The best way to address this, and we've talked about this before, is with the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. And there's 2 requirements. Number 1, CPU cores times 4 equals RAM. Number 2, CPU core count equals video RAM. So as we look at these numbers, another subscriber recommended going to take a look at what Puget Systems has to say. And I think that's a great idea. I absolutely agree with that. But what you want to remember is what Puget Systems is looking at is what they have tested. So they're going to recommend what they've tested, which is a great idea. And we can also go look at what NVIDIA recommends, and then I'm going to give you what I think. Now remember, we've built 4 classes of machines that we've identified for content creation. A 10-core, a 16-core, a high-end desktop, and a workstation. And we're talking specifically about a workstation. So the title of this video, which is better for workstations, comparing NVIDIA RTX 30XX specs and the NVIDIA RTX 8000 series, because I want to address that, because there's things we need to talk about as we talk about building or buying a computer that Puget Systems doesn't address. They look at it from, they build computers. I'm a consultant, I build computers, but I don't build on the scale that they do. But I look at, what's going to be the best bang for the buck, whether I build it or whether you build it. And the way I look at it from our perspective, as we've come to learn about this, yes, look at your software, see what the requirements are. But you also need to look at your hardware and see what those requirements are. One, what your motherboard is. Okay, because we're talking about a workstation, we're talking about the WRX80. So we have 7 16-lane slots. We still have the same spacing issue. To address family fun, 2 RTX 3070s. Okay, if you're going to use 2 RTX 3070s, good deal, good bang for the buck. You're going to have to use something like an RV-Link bridge if you're going to link those together. And by the way, you can't. Why? If you link 2 RTX 30X series anything together, going forward, that only works on an RTX 3090. So it used to work on the RTX 20 series, but it doesn't work on the RTX 30XX series. Only an RTX 3090 and the RTX A's. Something to remember. So if there's a potential, you may use 2 video cards. You look at the application. The applications are going to tell you, 1, they will address probably 1 video adapter. 2, they might address a second video adapter. But even if you're able to bridge them together, your video card, because these are 4 slots wide for an NVLink bridge. Okay, here's a good example. Let's look at some RTX bridges. Now, both of these are made by EVGA. Both of these are 4 slots. One of these is for the RTX 20 series, and one of these is for the RTX 30 series, but they are both 4 slot. Now this one says specifically for the 30 series down here at the bottom. And right there, GeForce RTX NVLink Bridge 4 slot for 30 series products. This one fits, and this is required, and this is the only one that works on the RTX 3090. Now this just happens to be from EVGA. So why is that important? Okay, so you buy an RTX 3090, and say it's more than 2 slots wide. Well, guess what? You're not going to be able to put 2 in a machine, and you're not going to be able to use one of these bridges. Why? Well, the video card has to be 2 slots wide or less to be able to use this on a 4-slot bridge. So if you've got a workstation like the WRX80 and you want to put 2 RTX 3090s side by side, has to be this. It cannot be this other bridge, because this is made for the RTX 20 series. But you have to read the fine print and you have to know the difference. And it only works on the RTX 3090. Things have changed, and keeping up with some of this stuff. And that's another reason why you have to get a new video card, is because the old video cards, by the way, are not going to have the driver supported. So I wouldn't go buy a brand new old video card. And right now I would be very careful where you get a video card from, because there's going to be a lot of dumping since they're closing down the Chia mining in China. Something to think about. So even if you're looking at like an AMD card, I believe Sharon, he sent us a message about it being available on Newegg. When I looked yesterday, I looked at where it was shipping from. And you want to pay attention that you're only buying a video card from a reputable vendor, not just on a reputable vendor site, but you're buying from a reputable vendor. Why? Well, with these cards being dumped, you might get hold of a card that's been pushed really, really hard, and that's a bad thing. So remember that. So if we settle the issue on a video card, whether two RTX 3070s is better than one RTX 3090, on a workstation, I would strictly go with an RTX 3090. One, you have to think about the resource. And the first resource is how wide is it? On a workstation with 7 slots, it needs to be 2 slots wide or less. Now, there are cards that are showing that I have not seen available yet. So what we're going to have to do is kind of wait and see what happens. Now, at this point in time, it's not a matter of what you want, it's more a matter of what you can get. So if you can get an RTX whatever, for example, we have another client that we've been helping with his build specs, and we probably won't do a video on it, but I'll just suffice to say he's going to build on, and he's coming from a 10-year-old machine, but he's decided he's going to build a high-end desktop. So he's going to use the Gigabyte TRX 40 Designare. He does not need a workstation, but for him, that's going to be a 10-year machine. But for those, so back to the issue of the specs. One, we've addressed an RTX whatever you can get your hands on. Will you be able to get your money out of it? More than likely, you'll be able to do that. But if you can get your hands on an RTX 3090, that would be the way to go, and that would be my preference. Now, as we look at those specs, and I want to balance this with some information, we'll bring this back around, because keep in the back of your mind the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. Nobody has anything like that. And I agree, for those of you that don't use Adobe, we don't either. We use DaVinci Resolve and Vegas Pro, which is getting ready to upgrade as well. But nobody has specs with the specificity that Adobe has right now. It's amazing, it's extremely simple, and it's very helpful in a situation like this. So if we have 32 cores and we have 128 gigs of RAM, that's a starting point. But the problem is the video card needs to match the processor. So if we have 32 cores, we need 32 gigs of RAM on the video card. And an RTX 3090 is just kind of under that. So let's take a look at some more specs. We'll bring that back around because we need to consider all of our options. Now, if I can get my hands, and this is a big if, but if I could get my hands on an RTX 3090, I don't care how big it is, for $1,500, okay. I can always change it out, upgrade it, and I've got room I could add to it later. But if I'm in a spot where I've already got an RTX 3090 that takes up those 3 slots, then my option is, because I've occupied 3 slots because it's 3 slots wide, most of the RTX 3090s are either 3 or 3.5 slots wide. So if that's your case, you need a 2-slot card. And if you're looking at a 2-slot card, the other things you need to consider is how much power is required for that RTX 3090, 750 watts. If we look at a workstation class card, what are we looking at? 300 watts. So if we put 2 of those in the machine, 600 watts, or maybe it's 250 watts. What we need to do is look at all the parameters. It's not just what the vendor says they can use. For example, DaVinci Resolve, the free version, will use the first primary GPU. However, DaVinci Resolve Studio can make use of 2 GPUs. Well, if I'm going to use 2 GPUs, I got to be able to bridge it. And if I'm going to bridge it, it's got to be 2 slots wide or less. It is what it is. Let's take a look at this information from GeForce. And we'll, of course, as always, have these links up in the description for the bibliography so you can go back and check and verify this. Now, this is an example. This compares the RTX 30, the RTX 20, the GTX down the line. The point of this is up to 24 gigs. So if an RTX 3090 only has 24 gigs, how does that fit with the formula? If we have a CPU that has 32 cores should equal the video RAM. If the video RAM is only 24 gigs, that doesn't quite measure up. Okay, put 2 of those in the machine. Simple, sounds great. 2 slots wide or less, good luck with that. Now we'll note these have game-ready drivers and they have studio drivers, and I want to make that distinction because we're going to swing back around with that in another video. I'll just suffice to say we'll talk about another feature that we can enable in the BIOS that couples that CPU and GPU together, but I'll get into that later. Now we're PCI Express 4, and one thing the formula does not deal with is the CUDA cores. Depending upon your application, usually special effects especially, make use of the CUDA cores. So when you go beyond that formula, for example, you use DaVinci Resolve, something like CUDA cores in DaVinci Resolve will matter for the special effects. And I will say, for those that are looking for special effects, I'll just say go to Tool Form, and if you're looking for effects, that's the place to be. But back to the question from Family Fun, because of what he's looking for a workstation, we have another subscriber. Let me show you that message. And this is from Baba Kasari. He has an RTX 3090 and it's 3 slots, a 3-slot GPU. And I want to thank you guys for the questions and comments, because we're here to help. But because we're getting so many questions, that's why we're doing this video, because it's a lot of information. Suffice to say, what Babak I was able to do was, because his first question was, okay, a WRX 80, which one, ASUS or Gigabyte? I said, well, I can make a case for either one. But when he itemized what he had, I knew what he had, which was the Gigabyte. And I told him, I said, we've been using Gigabyte ever since. You guys remember when we went from AT to ATX style? Well, when we went to ATX style, the first motherboard we used was a Gigabyte. So we have a history we've built with everything you can imagine, and a lot of motherboards that don't exist right now. Every once in a while, we'll try something new, and it reminds me why we no longer try that brand. I'll leave it at that. But historically, if you're going to build with AMD, Gigabyte. And if you're going to build with Intel, ASUS. Okay, ASUS is also the one that I would go to first for a workstation motherboard. ASUS is also the one I would look at for a 24/7 motherboard that's a workstation with PLX chips, which this does not have. But in the past, when we were considering the X299, which is now too far back to go that far back, we were looking at a motherboard, a workstation class, on the X299 chipset that happened to be ASUS, that had PLX chips to give us more slots. We now have more slots on the WRX 80. We now have more resources, PCI Express resources. 7 16-lane slots, incredible. Love it. So knowing what Babak has, and that he has an RTX 3090 that's occupying 3 slots, and he cannot add another video card, I wanted to assure him he's got a good motherboard. But I want to share with him, as I said in the video, about what's going on with the video cards. And granted, an RTX 3090, if you could get one for $1,500, RTX 3090s have been like $3,000, $4,500. Well, when you're approaching that kind of money, I know this may sound crazy to some of you, but you really need to consider a workstation class card. And we're talking about the RTX A series. Now, Shannon has been looking at some of those RTX A series cards. And again, it's not just what the software can use now, but it's what the software is going to be using later. Because, you know, we're like a rabbit. It may seem like we're going down a rabbit hole, or it may seem like we're a dog chasing our tail. The applications are going to update according to the operating system. And because of the driver model with Windows 11, a lot of the old video cards are not going to be supported. So people are going to be forced to buy a new video card. You're going to chase the operating system where you want to or not, kicking and screaming, because you want to keep your application current to do whatever work you're doing. Your application is going to follow the operating system, and the operating system is going to take advantage of these other items, which brings up another point. Kind of on a side note, but Shannon asked about the 64 cores, and yes, that's a limitation of Windows 10. My expectation that will be taken care of with Windows 11. And you got to keep in mind, there's really 3 versions of Windows that pertain to what we do. Windows Home, which is what you buy on a brand new laptop, which I'm not wild about and I don't want to get into. Number 2, what we'd use here is Windows Pro. We've been using Windows Pro since Windows 2000. I'll just say, you know, those that remember NT 3.5, oh, wow. Anyway, I digress. So going forward, there's also a Windows for Workstations. I don't know that we're going to have to address that, and I believe, but I'll have to check. As long as we're 64 or less, we should be okay. But if I remember correctly, as the core count goes up, so do the requirements for the operating system. So we may start talking some more about, even though the question has not specifically come up, it's going to relate to what we're talking about. Are we going to have to go to Windows for Workstations? I hope not. I hope it's an option, because it's going to be a lot more expensive than being able to download the ISO and go get a key for what we're doing right now. So we will address that as the questions come up and as this becomes an issue, which it will, as we build more powerful machines. But as we build the machines we are currently building, and we're looking at a WRX 80, whatever motherboard you choose, 7 16-lane slots, somewhere in that vicinity, but a minimum of an RTX 3090 for a workstation. Now, whatever your core count is, videos, and I got to reiterate this again, the video core count on the RTX 3090 is below what some of these folks are asking about. If you've got 32 cores, you want 32 gigs of RAM. Okay, so you need to look at a workstation card. So let's look at some specs. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I get excited about this. So if 24 gigs is not going to do what we need, then we need to be looking at a workstation class card, specifically an NVIDIA RTX A6000, A5000, or an A4000. I would not look at the Quadro cards. Leave those out, just these top three. Now what we can do is we'll drill down and take a look at the specs, starting at an RTX A4000. Now from the perspective of the CPU, if we have a 32 core CPU and we need 32 gigs of video RAM, that's not going to measure up. If we look at the A5000, we have 24 gigs. Okay, the A5000 has 24 gigs, which is on par with an RTX 3090. Another curious feature is, if you look at those specs, those video cards, the form factor is 2 slots wide, dual slot. PCI Express Generation 4 by 16, and oh looky there, 230 watts. You can go down that road, but if you do, you need to look at this road. You're buying a more expensive video card, but you're buying a more efficient video card. And that's what I want you to keep in mind. Now, I believe Shannon had said that he had bought one of these and he's waiting on delivery. I don't remember if it was the A5000. I think that's right. He's still waiting. So that's an option. But in this class of a video card, you know, we're still waiting on the AMD card. Now, Shannon also sent me a link, as I mentioned a while ago, about the new AMD card that's going to be available. It's now shown listed here in the US on Newegg from Ant Online. That's another option, but you got to remember that does not have CUDA cores. If you're going to do rendering, CUDA cores are a big deal. It's a more advanced, we can get into that in another video, but it's just a more advanced feature. And the reason I say that, and I've mentioned this before, the last time we did a rendering test was about 2 or 3 years ago. Real informal with Vegas Pro. We did some videos on that stuff. Enough of what we saw was that 10% was for the GPU. Now, I've had a bone to pick with video card vendors for a long time because I thought they've been too expensive for the last 5 years. Well, that's kind of out the window right now with availability. But at 10% of rendering, that just didn't register with me. But now the last test I did, which was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, kind of informal, I did a double check. Couldn't believe what I saw. In Vegas Pro, the rendering now is at 80% on the GPU. So does the GPU matter? Absolutely. If I'm doing 80% of my rendering, which in the past has been for your special effects and what you see in the little window as all that overlay goes on. So as it's rendering all that out, that's where time is money. So if I can render a video faster, I can get back to work and do my job. As Adobe said, our goal with that formula, with what they're doing with the software, is to not impede or prevent you from doing your work. We want to get out of the way so you can do what you do. It's about doing as much in real time as possible. If a video that used to take me, say, an hour to render, and if that was at 10%, and if now I can render that at 80%, that could be an hour video that goes down to, like, say, in round numbers, 15 minutes. To me, that's significant. To me, that's worth it. Now, back then, and the rendering we're doing is on an AMD Radeon Pro WX 9100. Can't get one of those now. We can look on PCPartPicker. I'll have a link up to show you where it's at, what the price is. But for the numbers, if I were going to buy an AMD card, something comparable to the WX 9100, which I thought was expensive back then, would be the new card that they've come out with, the new Radeon Pro. Different configuration number. I don't have it in my head right now, but I'll have the link up in the Newegg so you can find it. Not available on Amazon yet, but give it time. But the point of that is, if you're looking strictly on RAM based on the formula, that's option number 2. So really the best option for a workstation system, and that's what I'm advocating, is a workstation graphics card. However, get your hands on whatever you can get your hands on. You got to get that machine up and running. That's what we're facing. That's what we're all facing right now. You can always change. You can always upgrade. If you're blessed to get your hands on an RTX 3090 right now, more power to you. I think that's wonderful. But if you're looking to upgrade from that, I wouldn't get a second RTX 3090, especially if you're on a workstation. I would look at something higher class for power consumption, rendering capability, which would be how much RAM it's got, and how much space it occupies. 2 slots wide or less, which means you can bridge them. Cool. So now that we've looked at the A5000, let's take a look at the A6000. The A6000 has 48 gigs of video RAM. Does that exceed the CPU? Absolutely. A 32-core CPU, according to the formula, which is a starting point, needs 32 gigs of video RAM. I can take this up to 48 gigs. I'm in one slot. Look at the power requirements, 300 watts. Now 300 watts is a big deal when you're looking at power for a whole machine, because that means I can get a 1200 watt power supply, and I'm in business. I'm still good. And I'm using one video card, so I don't have to worry about resources. The software will eventually take advantage of it. And at the point we're at in time right now, this is a 10-year machine. Now, yes, that's an expensive video card, but it's not proprietary. Why do I say that? Well, years ago, we've been doing this since 1992. Do y'all remember SGI, Silicon Graphics? Back when we had the live meeting, which I missed, and I appreciate everybody's support, we had a viewer, one of our members that used to come to the live meeting, and he was pretty stoked that he bought an SGI. I think he spent about $15,000 on it. And we went through, talked to him about it, and said, look, anything proprietary is a bad idea. I think that was back in time when Rambus was real big. So he spent $15,000, bought that SGI. He swung back around 3 years later with his head down and said, man, that was a mistake. I'm like, well, you know, we tried, but he was so caught up in the technology, which I agree, they were doing some amazing things. But technology does not stand still. It keeps going. For example, we've just done a BIOS update on the TRX 40. We're getting ready for another BIOS update because the new set of chips are coming out on the Threadripper 3 for the TRX 40 of the 5000 class. What's going to happen with what we're doing on the Workstation? I expect we're going to see something new, but not until next year. This is first generation. When we built our first Ryzen computer, we didn't build until we built when we built our first Ryzen computer, we didn't build until we built a second generation. That Ryzen 1800 now does not meet the specs for Windows 2000 because it has to be a 2000 or newer processor. That 1800 does not measure up. TPM is fine, but the processor doesn't measure up. So as good as it is at that time, as we go forward, it's not good enough going forward for Windows 11. So if I want to keep the software on that machine, I got to upgrade the processor. And by the way, that's DDR3, so that ain't going to happen. So we go to a new platform, and TRX 40 or WRX 80. WRX 80s, if you need the resources, that's it. And if you need the processing power, that's it. And if you need a video card, this is it. Now the question is going to be getting our hands on one, because I don't know when these are going to be available. But look at what we've got. Number one, 48 gigs of RAM. So we exceed what the processor can do. So those of you that are doing rendering, it will keep that model up in memory and you won't be worried about paging. And that's also another feature of the Gigabyte WRX 80, that if we build the machine, right now it's looking like it may just be a motherboard unboxing. But if we build a machine, there's a feature in the BIOS about cache that I'll just say I'd love to explore. So number one, we got 48 gigs of RAM. Number two, it only requires 300 watts. Number three, it's a dual slot video card. And number four, because it's dual slot, we can be bridged. And if we bridge them, that's two A6000s, which would be 48 times 2. So yes, that's a lot of video card, but if that's your business and you're building a workstation, then I would strongly encourage a card like that. That's like a computer within itself. Everything is relevant to what you're doing, whether it's a hobby, whether you're earning a living with it, or whatever you're doing. But if we're in a high-end desktop, I would look at an RTX 3090, but I would want it 2 slots wide. If I'm looking at a workstation, I could live with an RTX 3090 if I could get my hands on one, but depending on the price and where I'm at and the kind of work I'm doing, I need to get my hands on an RTX A series, one of those. And my preference, any one of those three can be bridged. So if you start with like an A5000, you can always bridge another A5000 to it. But right now, that's where the bridge technology is going. So, something to think about. And something else I'll mention that's kind of an interesting feature is resizable bar. Number one, officially, resizable bar is supported on the RTX 30 series. So an RTX 30 whatever, 60, 70, 80, 90s. Okay, resizable bar is also going to be supported on the A series cards. It's not documented, but it's supposed to be there. What's going to be required, we'll do a separate video. The BIOS will have to be updated, and from what I've read, when you do that integration, you only want to do that integration if you update the BIOS on the video card. So the next thing I did was I took a look for the driver that supports the A1000 series card. And what I found was the R460U1 driver, which is 460.89. This is the WHQL. This has a release date of 12/15/2020. And right here, Added support for the new RTX A6000. This point's extremely important. Do y'all remember what we went through back with the RTX 2000 series, I believe it was? One, we had a heat issue. There was a lot of talk about that. But two, really the crux of the matter was the driver problem. That was crazy. So we had to go through some of those hoops. Now, there's two kinds of drivers. If you're using an RTX 3090, you've got your game ready driver and your studio driver. To be able to use this resizable bar, right now it says you have to use the game driver. Right now, if it's going to work on the RTX A series, like an RTX A6000 series, that's not a game ready driver, so that's why it left me scratching my head, and I went looking to see what kind of driver support we had. And that tells me right there, there's driver support, whatever you want to call it, for an NVIDIA RTX A6000. If we have a driver, that means we're going to have one, a driver, two, there's going to be a BIOS update from the manufacturer, whatever we've got, and we can turn on that feature. Now, right now, officially, there are a list of games that are going to support that, which is a feature of, actually, it's an extension of the PCI Express interface to allow information, like you do with rendering, to be better integrated so the transfer from CPU to GPU is faster, which means the applications are going to have to be written for it, which means we're on the bleeding edge of technology, so all those applications that you go check and see what their specs are, you're probably going to have to ask a question to tech support, which they're not going to know, but because you ask it, they're going to start looking into it. Because whatever they get questions for, vendors take that stuff seriously and they work on it. For example, Adobe, listening to the video by Puget Systems with the interview of their top developer, talked about the people they have working just on bugs, and they've asked people to submit your bugs because that's how they figure out how stuff works. When something breaks, they fix it. So when the first generation of these cards come out, we're going to have some buggy drivers. But until we get that integration so we can turn on resized bar and take advantage of it in our rendering applications, that's a shadow of things to come. That's what I want to share with you. So all these things are something to consider. But I got to tell you, I'm excited about it. So that's my perception, that's my perspective, and that's what I would do. Coming up in the next video, Mr. Serrano asked a question about the ASUS Hyper M.2 by 16 card version 2 PCI X3 comparison tutorial. And Mr. Serrano said, what would you recommend for an X570 board for adding M.2 drives? And his question was about 2 drives. So in this next video, we're going to take a look at dual M.2 NVMe PCI Express adapters. And what we may do after we talk about those adapters in general, because I have a list I'll share with you, that needed a video because that's a lot of information to some of the answers I don't mind, but it's like writing a dissertation. I need to do a video so we can share it with more folks. But anyway, after we do that about dual M.2 NVMe PCI Express adapters, we will pick one probably from Supermicro and walk through that and talk about it because you still got the same issue with a 4-drive card, bifurcated or unbifurcated. In other words, a bifurcated card that has a PLX chip or an unbifurcated card that requires motherboard bifurcation. It's a fascinating topic and I get excited about it. So I want to thank you guys for watching. This is BuilderBuy. My name is Gil Boyd. We're on to the next video. We're out.